Good evening. My name is Gary Williams, and I am the chapter president for the Canadian Aviation Historical Society, the Rolling Groom or Regina chapter, as well as being their national president. Welcome to this evening's Zoom meeting. Our host tonight is my good friend, Peter Maw. He has been both a national and chapter member since the beginning of 1993 and was our chapter president for several years. This talk is the first of an 18-day trip taking him from Harlingen, Texas to Florida and ending in Miami. He has broken the talk into 3 parts. The first is the Confederate Air Show 86 and across to Mobile, Alabama over a period of 5 days from October the 9th to the 13th, 1986. I know you will enjoy his presentation and will be looking forward to the next installment coming in 2021.
Now, after a very enjoyable trip across Canada in June of 1986, I decided to join the same group of British enthusiasts for a fall tour. I left Regina for Calgary on June 7th, overnighted and traveled south on the 8th. The flight was Calgary, Houston to McAllen, and then by bus to Brownsville. And the British contingent arrived about 2 hours later. My roommate again was Steve Morrison, an Rolls-Royce engineer from Scotland. And there were several people on the tour that were retreads from the one before. Unfortunately, there's no steermans in Harlingen, so I just put this slide up from later on in the trip. These were taken in Zelwood, Florida. Most of the first morning was spent looking around Harlingen and the parking area and trying to take pictures in cloudy conditions. This is an arrival and practice day for the participants. The first aircraft I shot after the sun came out was this nice Avenger taxiing in. And before he even had a chance to park, a flight of Harvard flew over in a practice flight. And this was followed by a nice Mustang on the taxiing in. The second Avenger of the day followed the Mustang. And you always thought the Avenger was a large aircraft, but you don't really get the scale of the beast until you actually see the people in the cockpit. Also arriving was this Spitfire 9 in, I believe it's Douglas Bader's markings. And if anybody remembers the Canadian Warplane Heritage Hangar Fire 1993, where they lost several aircraft, this is one of the aircraft they lost. It was on loan to the CWH by the Confederate Air Force. And while on the flight line, I heard a loud whooshing sound and looked over to see a plume of black smoke and the sound of a jet engine. This was followed by this ex-Swiss de Havilland Venom taxiing out, and it was still using the old Black Power cartridge system. And that's the one and only time I've ever seen that used. The Confederate Air Force started out with some of the Battle of Britain movie aircraft. And this is one of them. It's a Spanish-built version of the Messerschmitt 109. And it is the only one I've ever seen fly. They only had the one there, not even any others on the ground. While the sun was out, we went over to check out the trainers and liaison aircraft. And there we found a couple of mentors, including this one in Moroccan markings. Morocco did operate some mentors, but I don't know if this camouflage scheme is actually appropriate or not. The only ones I've seen were the two-tone brown with more horizontal demarcations than this one. It still looks nice. At the end of the line was this faulty Valiant in USAF training colors. That Confederate Air Force, as they're called, name their aircraft. You see faulty PT-13 Valiant underneath their logo on the tail. In the row in front of them, I found this nice Piper L4, and there's a Stinson L5 behind it. The last aircraft of the day was this P-38 Lightning in racing colors. I photographed this in 1986 and in 2001 while on a ferry flight. There was a loud bang and one of the engines started to run rough and the cockpit filled with smoke. The pilot made a hasty landing in a Mississippi cotton field, sustaining some damage. It was found that one of the turbochargers had a compressor failure. The owner started work on the restoration and then he gave up and sold it. It went to Europe and is now flying as part of the Red Bull fleet. The last pictures I saw was in natural metal with the Red Bull logo on the side. The next day started off sunny, and there's more aircraft continue to arrive, including this FB-111. The last I heard, this thing was still in Davis Monthan, awaiting its fate. Amongst the transport aircraft was this C-46 Tinkerbell. That was the first one I'd ever seen fly. After that, about 2 years later, it's based in Thompson, and I saw several of the Air North or Northland Air Manitoba C-46s coming and going. And behind that, just above the tailplane, you can see Dakota, or not a Dakota, a Canso in Australian markings. Altogether at Harlingen, there was 3 B-17s. This is the first one I saw. It is a sentimental journey. That was the Confederate Air Force's flagship aircraft. They also played this song, Sentimental Journey, over and over again for what seemed to be 4 days straight. It gets on your nerves after a while. And here is the Spit 9 going out as a practice flight. The other Spitfire they had was this ex-Irish Air Corps T Mark 9. And it is in fake Second World War markings. There's one A26 that had undergone a non-mark conversion at some point, tell by the long nose. And as far as I could tell, this one is still flying and it had been once owned by Bob Deemert in Carmen, Manitoba. One of the many B-25s that were there in the background. The Confederate Air Force had also picked up a large number of the aircraft used in the movie Tora, Tora, Tora. This modification of a faulty Valiant represents a Kate torpedo bomber. Not to be outdone, they also had this version of a Grumman Wildcat. Although it says Grumman on the tail, this is an FM2 version, which was built by Eastern Aircraft under license. And it is on pre-war markings from the USS Ranger. There is a P-39 Airacobra in Russian markings, and in the background you can see a tail of a P-63 King Cobra. For some reason I didn't take the pictures of the King Cobra on the ground, I only have it flying. And even then it's too small to be worthwhile showing it to you. There was a actual Douglas Dauntless there, although it did not take part in the show. It just sat in their maintenance area. (1986) was the 75th anniversary of the U.S. Naval Aviation, and they had marked up several aircraft with special markings. This one I dropped in just to see the show. In the background, you can see Southwest Airlines 737 tail, so that's how close the action was to the terminal. Diamond Lil was a LB-30, was pre-production B-20 or B-24. This one was actually an ex-RAF aircraft, AM-927. And before it got to Britain, it was involved in a trading accident and turned back over and consolidated. And they altered it to a transport configuration and used it as company transport throughout the war. You can see the transport windows on the bottom. Then the rain started. We had quite a bit of rain that day, and when we weren't hiding inside the hangars, we were hiding underneath aircraft. You can see this Tora Harvard conversion taxiing by in the shower, and a whole bunch of people in the background hiding underneath the wing of the P-38. Here's some under a B-25. I was hiding underneath the wing of Texas Raiders, which was the second of the 3 B-17s that were there. And here's the rest of the crowd that were underneath the B-17. One thing to watch out for if you ever have to do that is that the turbochargers will drip black goop out of them, and that stuff never washes out. You can also see in this photograph there's a slope up towards the taxiway. That came into play a little bit later, which you'll see. It caused a lot of problems. By this time, Diamond Lil had landed, and the first of the rain showers is just moving off. And it's coming in here with a nice threatening sky overhead. The rain came down so hard, the drainage system had trouble taking care of it. It didn't take long, but before it happened, the aircraft had to sit in the water. You can see these two F-16s almost up to their hubcaps in the water. They were in a low spot, and just ahead of them, the ground was wet and not too much water. When it looks at the waves, there's a drain right underneath the tail of that A4 Skyhawk. That's where all the people are standing. I mentioned the problems with the rain. Well, it saturated the clay soil. They tried to move Texas Raiders or taxi it forward onto the taxiway and out of the mud, but all it did is plow straight into the side of the slope. And after quite a bit of digging and shoring up, they got it out, but it took a fire truck attached to each wheel to pull up. This is one of the aircraft I was glad to see fly. It is next Spanish Air Force version of the HE-111, and it was another Battle of Britain movie aircraft. In July 2003, it was on a ferry flight and had a double engine failure and crashed at Cheyenne, Wyoming. It was written off. At the time, it was the last of the HE-111 line still flyable. This Beech AT-11 Kansan was a bombing and gunnery trainer version of the Beech 18. This particular aircraft had propane set up to make the guns appear to be firing. It looked fairly good, but it was loud, but still seemed a little hokey. And in the background, there is a Bot Corsair. Underneath the nose of the cans, you can see Bob Hooper's Aero Commander. This is the third of the P-17s that was there. This is Chucky. It was owned by Doc Hospers at the time and named after his wife, whose nickname was Chucky. So I guess if you want to buy a bomber, you can get away with it by naming it after your wife. You'll hear more about Chucky shortly. Since Texas Raiders had moved close to the taxiway before it got stuck, it was in the way of other large aircraft. Here the Australian Cancer was trying to taxi out with a large crowd gathered, and they were just checking the clearance on the nose of the B-17. Underneath the word Texas Raiders, you can see what appears to be a bare patch of metal. And it actually looked like they had grease smeared out in the aircraft when they painted it, and it just stripped off. The Martin Marauder to finish off the day. This was the one and only Martin Marauder flyable at the time. Unfortunately, in 1995, it was destroyed in a training accident, although I believe there may be one or two more that were salvaged out of Alaska being built to, or restored to flyable status. Day 3. Didn't rain, but it started off mixed sun and cloud. And we started off with this ex-RCF P40N, or Kitty Hawk 4. This was once labeled RCF number 867. And it's now part of the Commemorative Air Force. And in 2019, it was taxiing in and had a gear failure and did some damage to the belly and shock loaded the engine, and it's been undergoing restoration and is part of the 12 Planes of Christmas, both in 2019 and 2020. Here's Tinkerbell again. You may or may not be able to see a puff of black smoke underneath the rear fuselage just below the star. And while Tinkerbell was on a practice flight, it started putting out a large plume of smoke, and it got thicker and thicker, so it landed on one of the old runways at the far end of the field and just sat there. Here is Diamond Lil again. Diamond Lil is still flying, although it is now in a two-tone brown and green scheme. I mentioned Chucky. While we were there, we heard that Chucky was offering rides, and I figured I'd never get another chance to fly in a B-17. And so I trooped over some of the members of our group and put my money down, and we got to be on the first flight of passengers. And if you ever get a chance to do something like that, you should, because you never know what's going to happen after that. And I didn't know that about 2 months short of 30 years later, I'd have a B-17 flying past my house offering rides. But here we were sitting in Chucky, sweltering in the heat. Although there was some cloud, it was Chucky was sitting in the sun most of the day, and it must have been 100 and some odd degrees inside the fuselage. We had a very interesting pre-flight safety briefing. First of all, they warned us not to fly on or lean against cables and wires, because the whole airplane flies on cables and wires. Then they point out the emergency exits, like the gunner's windows and the radar or radio operator's hatch. And then they said, if we happen to go in inverted, which is a phrase I've never heard before or since on a briefing. But they mentioned we might be able to crank open the bomb bay and get out that way. While Chucky was flying, we were able to crawl through from nose to tail. And I remember going through the bomb bay and across the little catwalk they have, and you see the Texas passing by underneath the aircraft with the cracks around the doors. This is taken out of the gunner's window on the right-hand side. Looking rearward. I'm not sure the name of this river, but it's the one that's just north of the Rio Grande. This picture is in a nose compartment with South Padre Island coming up. By the time I got into the nose, we were flying down the island, and I got to see South Padre through the site of the Norton bomb site, which they still had mounted. Much of the plexiglass in Chucky was old and yellow because it was original, and one of the reasons they're taking passengers is the owners of Chucky and some other B-17 owners were trying to raise enough money to get new sets of plexiglass made for them. The last pictures I saw of the aircraft, it had looks like brand new glass in it. And here's another one on the right-hand side. This is taken out of the window of the radio operator's room. Somewhere I have a certificate signed by Chucky herself saying that I flew in her aircraft. And after Doc Hesper's passed away, Chucky held on to it for a while, and then she sold it. And it is now flying out of, I believe it's Tillamook, Oregon, and has been renamed Madras Maiden and repainted. And that was the end of day 3. And in fact, they had to hold up the bus for us, so we did a whip round, and all threw money into the hat, and as a tip for the driver for going overtime. And he was quite pleased with the amount that we gave him. Day 4, which was our last day at Harlingen, started off big sun and cloud. Overnight, several more aircraft had flown in, including these T-37. There's 4 of them from NATO training school. I believe it's in Texas. They didn't take part, they just wanted to watch the show. Before the show started, we were able to get around on the tarmac again. And that lasted until 10 o'clock, and they booted us all out behind this fence. And you can see the Marauder Diamond Wheel in the background, B-17, U.S. Navy Twin Huey in Harvard. And here was Chucky again, taking off another load of passengers just before the air show started. The first couple hours of the air show was civilian and modern displays, and then they went on to reenacting major events of the Second World War. And one of the civilian aircraft was this BD-5J. As we cut the tail off, it's trying to get it in between a head in the one side and our speaker in the neck or the other side. The F-111 flew, and it even did the Australian trick of dumping fuel into the afterburner and lighting it off. It was quite spectacular, but with that lighting addition, my old Pentax camera didn't like the thing, but that's the best I could do. And I've got the requisite heads in the foreground, just like any other air show. And then they started reenacting the Second World War, starting with the Battle of Britain. And here's Messerschmitt and Heinkel in the air together again. You can see the cloud starting to build up. They had some training aircraft in the air, but they don't show up well at a picture, just a bunch of little dots. But I managed to get these 2 zeros taking off for their part to reenact the Battle of the Pearl Harbor. And here they are, 4 zeros coming into the attack. The big blob on the right-hand side is one of the loudspeakers. And here they are again. You can see it's raining off to the left. This was the first time I'd ever seen the big pyrotechnics displays that they like to put on for their Tora and Pearl Harbor reenactments. And here's a Kate flying through plumes of smoke. And Kate in a zero with one of the fireballs in the field below them, next to the runway. Some more fire and some aircraft. At first glance, it may look like these guys are just flying around haphazardly, but they all had their own designated circuit to fly in. And the overall effect was pretty good. If you count the plume of smoke up on the top, there's about 7 or 8 aircraft in this picture. Some of them pretty small though. And then P17 came in there. You can see it's trailing smoke, and 2 flares indicate wounded on board. This was actually the last picture I took at the air show. They then put a pause in the show because the rain was about to move in, and it rained so heavily they actually canceled the show for this. But we had a date with Southwest Airlines, so instead of standing around the rain, we all trooped up into the terminal. They load us on board the aircraft and back us out away from the gate, and then realize that because the air show had been canceled, there's still all the buckets of gasoline and dynamite beside the runway. And they had to blow them all off before we managed to take off. And while we were sitting on the aircraft, you'd feel and hear large clumps, and there's a flash. And the guys out on the other side of the plane were taking good pictures, but I was on the wrong side. As we left that night and flew to New Orleans, and after an hour or so to wander around town, boarded our bus to Panama City, Florida. And on the way, we stopped for lunch and at Mobile, Alabama, and to visit the Battleship Memorial Park with the battleship USS Alabama and submarine USS Drum. And they had some aircraft and rockets and some armor and artillery on display. Much of the aircraft on display outside is now inside a new building, and USS Drum is now out of the water. Since I was there, they've been hit by 2 hurricanes which damaged the Drum and sped up their plans of getting it out of the water. The Drum was the first of the Gato submarines to be launched and commissioned, and it completed 13 war patrols and sank over 80,000 tons of shipping in a self-guided tour of both the submarine and the battleship. In between rain showers, here is some of the aircraft. There's this C-47 in Strategic Air Command markings. And behind is a rescue Albatross and a Redstone rocket. On the deck of the Alabama is a Kingfisher on the catapult. I checked Google Earth not too long ago, and the Kingfisher is no longer on the catapult, so it may be either inside the building or the aircraft exhibit hall, or it was damaged by the hurricane. As I said, we do a self-guided tour of the battleship, including crawling into one of the two forward turrets. And my Scottish friends actually found the turret more claustrophobic than the submarine. You can see some of the armor and artillery on display, and the bridge heading off across the mouth of Mobile Bay and into Florida. And the last picture, in the end, this talk off is this P17 Calamity Jane. Calamity Jane is the markings it was put on before it served in Vietnam, where it did over 80 trips into North Vietnam. And you can see it's raining again. Fortunately, that is the end of the rain for the trip, and we had fairly good weather for us to Florida and into Alabama. And that'll be the topic of another show. Or we spent the next 4 days operating out of Panama City, where we visited Pensacola, Florida, and the flight line, Edgerton Air Base, Fort Rucker, Alabama, and Army Airfield, and spent most of the day at William Tell 86. And then we moved on to Eastern Florida and worked our way down from Orlando and Selwood area, Cape Canaveral, and down to Miami. Thank you very much.